Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about textures and materials. One of my favorite steps when it comes to creating my projects because I get to play around with colors and textures and all of those amazing things. Okay, so roughly today, or according to my outline, we're going to talk about the different materials and when to use them. We're also going to talk about how lighting affects materials, some shortcuts for nodes, and how to use external textures if you download them online, which is something I use a lot in my work. Okay, let's begin. I've gotten questions about my materials, and I've given people my nodes or how to achieve a certain material, only for them to find out that it didn't work for them. And so I had to mention this because I never really thought about it, but materials look better on an object that fits it. So if you want to add a cloth material on something that should be metal, it doesn't really work. So let's say adding a lace fabric on something that inflates doesn't make any sense. And so it might not give you the same effect that it gives me on something that isn't inflatable. Even though I've used lace before on inflatables, I just don't care when it comes to realism. I guess the reason why I use 3D is not to create realism, it's to create scenes that I cannot create in real life or will require a lot more work to create them in real life. But yeah, adding, let's say, I think this is something that I've mentioned in the sculpting tutorial previous to this one, where I talked about adding metallic materials to something that is flat. The reflections are going to be very uniform based on where the light is. There isn't going to be variations in the reflections on that object. You'll get probably a gradient of light to shadow based on where the light is coming from, as opposed to an object that has a lot of geometry. Another example is a knit fabric. That won't look good on a sphere. Well, it's a fabric, so you cannot just put it on something that is rigid and solid. It has to be something a little bit malleable or kind of gives that look. And then tiles won't look good on something that you can't put tile on in real life, like maybe a piece of fabric. The TLDR is that it's not about right and wrong when it comes to materials. You can be as creative as you want to be, you can be as crazy as you want to be, but the point is it's not going to show the material as what it is. So for something like the tiles on the inflatable, it's going to look as if it's an imitation of that tile texture, a print, rather than an actual tile texture. That's going to look completely different on something as a floor or walls. When it comes to art, you get to choose what you want to be believable. The second thing I want to talk about is not worrying about mastering every node that you can find over here in the shader editor. Just start with a principled BSDF and you'll be fine. Sometimes I even don't use that because it's just much easier to just use a simpler node. Like for instance, well, let's add an object so we can actually see what is happening. I'll add a round cube like always, because that's my favorite object. Make it a radius of 1 in the setting and shade it smooth. And then let's add a subdivision modifier just to make it better. Okay, and I always have my render view over here. Let's say I create a new material and I want a glossy material. Just knowing that decreasing the roughness is going to make your material glossy is enough. And then you can change the color and that's a material for you. And then you start from there elevating your materials. But you can also look at other shaders, like for instance, diffuse BSDF. That's just a simpler way of adding just color. So if I add the same color, if you hover over the color, you can just hit Control C or Command C on a Mac and then paste it just by hovering over here and you can paste the color. The only difference between this one and diffuse is that diffuse doesn't have glossiness because it doesn't have specular in it, which is what you have over here. So increasing the roughness is just going to make it a little bit more rough, and then, or increasing it is just going to make it rough, and then decreasing it is going to make it less rough. But it's not going to make it glossy because that's a simpler shader. If you go to another shader, for instance, like glossy, and you connect this to the surface, then paste that color as well by hovering over it. And you can change the different distributions based on what you want. I always keep it on the default, but feel free to experiment. And then if I go down, then we get a shiny material or something metallic, but it's just this simple material. And then if I go to glass BSDF, and instead of just pulling this to connect it, you can hit Control Shift and click on it and it'll go to view it. But if you don't have Node Wrangler, you have to go to Preferences and then add Node Wrangler in the add-ons. So that's what I'm doing when I switch between those materials. Now you have glass, and if you add the roughness, it's less reflective, and then you reduce the roughness and it's very glossy. You can change its color and you get colorful glass. But what I like to do is just use the Principled BSDF most of the time, especially because it has a lot more options, and it's good if you want to outsource materials because it has all the options that you need. So don't worry about mastering every custom material out there. As you practice, you'll end up just understanding how things work and you'll start making up your own materials. But note these things when you're trying to figure out what material you want to create. Good lighting makes the scene. I like HDRIs with some focused area lights here and there. If I make this metallic, you can actually see my HDRI. It's studio lights, and if I go to render and film, and then I remove transparent, you'll be able to see it. So this is my HDRI. This is where my lighting is coming from, and I don't have anything else at the moment. But since I don't want to render that, I just check transparent and saved it as my default when I open Blender. So lighting makes every material different. So let's change the HDRI. If we go to the world settings, and then I go over here, and I change this to this outdoor HDRI, then you'll see that it gives a different look. If I change it to this gym, for instance, then it gives it a different look. And if I increase the roughness a little bit so we don't really see the HDRI, there is this one as well. Every light setting is going to give you a different view of your material. So let's go back to my studio light, and then let's talk about the other thing that makes or breaks your materials, and that's the composition. The composition of your work matters. Reflective materials are nothing with nothing to reflect. Right here, we are reflecting the HDRI, but if I don't have an HDRI and I just rely on an area light, and let's give it a strength of 1,000, and I just rely on this, it's not going to look good because there's nothing to reflect. So you have to add, first of all, more light. So let's just bring this one back, delete this area light. And if I add other objects like a UV sphere, for instance, and position it over here, you can actually see this one reflecting it. Let's color it a different color so we can actually see it. You can see it right here. So the more you add to the scene, the better your materials are going to look, and the more they're going to affect each other even when it comes to color. Because with something green like this on a white object is going to give it a bit of a green hue, but right now it's too far away. And you can see it when I reduce the metallic to 0. You can see the green hint over here. So if you have a black background, your materials are going to look different from when you have a white background because the lights are going to reflect differently on your objects, and so your materials are going to look different. Okay, now let's talk about my most used nodes. Number 1 for me is Principled BSDF. It has all the settings that I need, and I can outsource materials and add them to the base color, the metallic, the roughness based on what I get with each material. So this is my number one node, which is a shader node. So if you look at here, when you want to add, there is input, there is output, and then color, converter, shader, texture, vector, script, and then group and layout, which are not necessarily nodes that are related to the texture, but rather for organization purposes. So this is just to add a frame and reroute. We'll take a look at how frame looks like. And then reroute is just when you have a lot of nodes on your tree and you want to just add reroute points so your lines are not confusing when you have a lot, those connecting lines. If you want to look at shaders, the different shaders, then you just go to shader. The ones I use the most when it comes to mixing shaders is the diffuse BSDF, which I just showed you, the glass BSDF, the glossy BSDF, and then another of my most used ones is mix shader, which you can mix two materials with based on a mask that you add. But I sometimes use it without a mask, and that creates a different look as well, which is really fun. And then principled BSDF, which is what we have right now. And then there's principled hair BSDF, which is what I use for the particles, the hair particles. And then there's principled volume, which I've used in this video for volume. And then transparent BSDF. I have used translucent, but I don't really like it that much. And then there is texture. So texture is what you add to your principled BSDF. And usually that's either an image that you bring from the outside, and we've talked about image textures before, or you can use one of these generated textures right in Blender, like the brick texture, checker texture. I've used the checker texture the most out of these top two. I don't really like the brick, I just like the uniformity of the checker. And then there is magic texture, noise texture. Noise texture I use a lot. Gradient texture I use every now and then. And then Voronoi texture is one of my most used textures. And then there's a wave texture that gives you sine waves and things like that. And you can combine these textures or add them or input them into each other to create different looks. Let's continue down. I use vector for bump, displacement, and mapping all the time, but I use mapping with float values rather than vectors. Mapping is when you change a texture's scale, rotation. I use it all the time, but I don't add it myself. I'll show you why. And then going back up above shader, there is converter. You convert a vector to float values with separate X, Y, and Z and separate color. And then combine is to combine them back into a vector. And then there is color ramp where you can remap values. There is also RGB to black and white, which I use a lot. There is also mix, which I use a lot to mix colors. And then there is math where you can multiply textures, where you can subtract and divide and add, and those are my most used ones. Then there's also grader, so you can omit parts of the texture if you want. After this series, I'm 100% doing more texture videos, more specific ones at least. And then with color, you can just play with the colors. So you can change the hue, saturation, and value of an image or of a texture if it's colored. Then you can change the brightness and contrast. I use invert color a lot. And then output is the material output. I don't use the other two. And then input is where I get info about an object or about hair particles or things about the geometry of an object. There's also layer weight, which I really, really enjoy using to kind of add variation of color into my object. You can also get camera data. So yeah, there's a lot you can use over here. And then texture coordinate is one that I use in every material almost. Light path is where you can change a material based on how it's reflecting light or where the light is coming from. So how will this object or how will this material look if this object is seen from a reflective material? I usually use this with glass if I want to remove the shadows from the glass and to enhance the caustics of the glass. And so I use is shadow ray. So wherever there's shadow, I'll remove it and add a transparent material and then change the color of it. But I've also used it in this video where I changed the material when the object is viewed from a reflective material. So you can create multiple materials for the same object based on where we're viewing it from. Okay, so let's delete this one and then let's subdivide this a little bit more. And then let's add some vertex groups or one vertex group, call it pin. And I want to inflate this because the materials look much nicer and something that has dimension. If you want to know more about the cloth simulation or inflating things specifically, you can definitely go to my Inflate Anything video and you'll find all the information you need over there. And then I am going to add some pressure, go to shape, select my pin group, and then add a little bit more fabric to it. Now let's talk about materials more in depth. When you add a material, this is what you get. And the color over here that you're gonna get is something like this. So it's not fully white, it's a little bit gray, and it doesn't have any reflections on it, just a little bit. And to me, this is perfect for a lot of things. You don't really need to change much. Sometimes for some of my projects where I don't need close-ups, this is what I use, and I just change the base color. And you can change the base color based on the RGB value, which are red, green, and blue, and then change the alpha as well, but I don't really use alpha. And yeah, you can change the color based on that. If all of the values are the same, then you're basically going through this value or this gradient over here, which is a grayscale, basically. But if you have a different value for red, increasing it is going to give us less red, so it's going to go the opposite way from the red. The green is going to do the same thing, and then the blue as well. So the less blue you're going to have, the more yellow. But we're going to make it fully white right now, and then go to HSV, which is the most intuitive way of choosing color, because this is how we think about color in real life. We don't really think about it in RGB form. So we have the hue, what color you're going to choose, and then how strong that color is. So if the saturation is the highest, then the hue is going to go around this circle that we have. And then we have value, which is how bright or dark those colors are. So the darkest is going to be black, no matter what the hue and saturation are. And then the highest is going to be the brightest color. It's not going to give you white. You have to reduce the saturation completely, so adding no color at all, and that will give you full white, even if the hue isn't at any value, because the zero isn't really a zero, it's a red, basically. And then you go 360 degrees, but here it's just a value from 0 to 1, so they're mapping it. But usually this is a value from 0 to 360, which is back to red. Okay, and hex is when you have a specific color from another software that you want to copy and paste. You can just paste into here. Yeah, but my most used one is HSV, and I usually have a palette, an image of a palette that I want to use imported, and I just put it over here. That's why I have this section over here in my shader view. I definitely have customized this, so you can do it like mine. I just have a render view over here, or a 3D viewport really, and the same goes over here. It's just here I have render view and here I have solid view. And then I have the shader nodes over here, and I have my objects over here, and then the settings, and then my image, just in case I have colors to pick from. Then I just use the picker, go over here, pick a color, so you can just pick a color and it's going to apply there. Okay, let's go to some bright colors. And then the next one in principled BSDF is metallic. 0 is basically nothing, and then 1 is everything. Usually when it comes to the textures and everything you're gonna see over here, is going from 0 as in black to 1 as in white. So if you have an image that's black and white and you input it over here in metallic, whatever is black in that grayscale image is going to be non-metallic. And if it's white, then it's going to be fully metallic. Right now, I'll just show you the solid ones and then I'll show you with textures. So if I go up to 1, then that's fully metallic. And then you have roughness. And the more you combine, the different materials you're gonna get. So right now, because we have metallic at 1, so it's fully metallic, then going to a roughness of 0 is going to make it extremely shiny, because that just means there's absolutely no roughness. And then if I increase the roughness to 1, then that's not going to make it metallic at all. Just gonna make a very weird dark material. And now if I reduce the metallic to 0 and I go to 0 in the roughness, then we're gonna get a glossy material. You see how when things are combined, the material completely changes? So this is what you're gonna learn to do, how to mix and match to get what you're actually looking for. And then IOR, I only use when I'm using glass. So let's go to transmission next. Now, if I go to a weight of 0, well, when it comes to Blender versions before 4, then you're not going to have it like this. It's just going to be transmission down below. But right here, it's just called weight and it's under transmission, but it's the same exact thing. So a weight of 0 means no transmission again. And then a weight of 1 is completely transparent and it's transmitting light basically. And then if I increase the roughness a little bit, it's going to change the look of this glass. And if I have the roughness on full, it's going to give me a weird transparent material. So let's decrease this to something a little bit nicer. And for me, the best result with glass material is when you have less saturation. So the less saturation, the better the glossiness. So if you want colored glass, it's better to have less saturation. And then the IOR is something that you can look up if you want, but you can also experiment with it. If 1.5 is apparently the optimal for glass, or like according to what Blender says, the default value of 1.5 is a good approximation for glass. But in the previous version of Blender that I've used, it was always 1.45. So changing this is going to give you something from a plastic material or something from something like this that doesn't really add any refractions to something that has a lot of refractions, like glass, for instance, which is 1.5. And you're gonna see this when you add other objects. So if I have a cube, let's say, especially if it's inside it, then you can actually see it better. And let's add a plane right behind our scene. Okay, I think we can see this better on a sphere. So if I do 1.7, it's going to distort the shapes that it's reflecting or that's inside it. And the less it is, so 1.2, it's going to have less distortion. So that's what I was trying to say. But with that cloth thing, it wasn't really showing it well. The higher you go, the more distortion you're gonna have. Okay, let's keep those in hand just in case. And let's show this one. I'll also show you a combination of my perfect glass for the majority of the projects. And you can play with the transmission as much as you want just to see what you get in the end. Let's change the material of the background to something that allows us to see things better. Let's do 1.5, that's the default. And if you want to return to the default, if you hover over any of the properties and you just hit delete, it's gonna give you back the default value. Okay, let's return this to 0 for transmission. And let's talk about specular. So now if I have the least amount of roughness, and let's change this to a different color that we can see better, and then go to specular, which if you're on Blender version before 4, then you're gonna find that roughness specular are directly on top of each other. I have roughness at 0, but I don't have any specular. You won't see any shine in any reflections on your material. So this is good for really rough materials that don't have any sort of light reflection. And then you can also bump this up to 1 and you'll get extreme reflections. I never really touch this, so it's always on 0.5 for me, if you're wondering. I only use it when I feel like the reflections are a little too much and I want to reduce them, but I never really need that anyways. And then sheen, which I never really use, but it's used for fabric mostly. So if you want to add a little bit of a sheen to your fabric, you can do that. And it gives you that satiny look. So it's good for velvet material, satin material, stuff that just have a little bit of sheen rather than just gloss. And then coat, which I also don't use really, but I've used it maybe once or twice. And that's to add like another level of shyness. It's kind of like adding a coating to your objects. And you can see the difference between having a coat and then not having a coating. From what I've heard, this is what they use for cars. So if you add this, then this is the material that is used for the glossiness of freshly painted cars or new cars. If you want to add colored lights to your scene, I usually just use regular lights, but emission is a good way to add that color, add that reflective light. So if I go to red, it doesn't have any strength right now, but if I go up to, well, I want it to go to 1, but it goes beyond that. And then I increase the roughness. I get something that resembles light, and strength is going to start to emit the color the higher you go, because that's how light goes. The stronger the light, the less color it has. So if I go up to 4, then it has less color because then it's just too bright to have or to emit color. So if I go back to 0, we're back to the start. Okay, that's all you need to know when it comes to the materials that I create. Now let's add a little bit more variation to our projects. We've seen how things look when I just increase this from a solid 0 to a solid 1. But let's say I want some parts to be a metallic and some other parts to just to be this glossy material. What I can do is add a Voronoi texture, and if you hit Control-Shift, if you have no Wrangler, then you can view it. And a Voronoi texture, if you want to know more about Voronoi, you're going to have to look up the math of it and how it works. But it's just a bunch of dots that interact with each other based on the algorithm that you're going to use. If I increase this to something like this, you can start seeing those circles melting into each other. And so it looks something like this. They're not circles anymore. And because it's a black and white image, especially the distance one, we have a black and white image that goes from 0 to 1, 0 being the blackest point and 1 being the whitest points. So inputting this into the base color and then viewing this is going to give us this. So it's the same material, but the color is going to be the Voronoi texture instead of that orange. And then if I input it instead in the metallic, everywhere where there is white, it's going to be metallic, and everywhere where there is black is going to be non-metallic. So if I get a, whatever this is called from this, and search for color ramp, it can adjust the values of the blacks and whites. I can remap those values. So if I bring the black over here, I'm increasing those blacks. So if I view this, you can see that I'm increasing those blacks. And then if I bring in the white, then I'm increasing the white. So we're kind of reducing the amount of grays in our image. But what I want is more white and less black. So now I have dots that are black, which are not going to be shiny or metallic, and then the whites are going to be metallic. So if I input this into the metallic and then I view this one, you can see where there is white, it's metallic, and then where there is black, it's the opposite. And if I add an invert color node, actually input it into the color, and then view it, this is going to invert my color. So whatever is white is going to be black, whatever is black is going to be white. And the factor is going to determine how much I want to invert those colors. So the middle is going to be just grays, but I want to invert it completely. And now if we put this into the metallic and view this, those whites are going to be metallic and the other ones are going to be non-metallic. And you can do the same with roughness as well. I don't know if you can see it, but there are little dots over here where things are not really shiny anymore. And then one thing you can do, if I delete this and input the metallic, or input this into the texture into the metallic, and then go to the white and then change the value a little bit, we're decreasing the metallicness of this texture or this material. So this is basically what you're doing over here when you say, oh, I don't want it to be fully metallic, I want just 0.8. So this, if you put this at 0.8, it's the exact same thing, but only for the places where there's white. So this is not going to be fully metallic anymore. And the same goes for black. If you want it to be a little bit more shiny, you can do it this way. The higher you go, the more metallic it's going to be. And if you go fully white, then it's going to be even more metallic than the rest of them because that's not fully white anymore. And you can also input it into transmission, which is not open yet, or the weight of the transmission. We bring this back to white. We reduce the metallic so we can actually see the transparent texture. And this is how you get parts of the image to not be transparent and parts of the image to be transparent. Again, the white is going to be transparent and the dots, because they're black, are not going to be transparent. And this will lead us into mixing shaders. So the next thing that I want to show you is how to mix two colors. So let's say I want to add another principled BSDF shader and I want to mix those two colors. I can pull this, add a mix shader. You can definitely just add it from here, or you can hit Shift A and search over here for whatever you need. The more you're going to use it, the more you're going to memorize things. And then we'll input this into the surface, and then we'll input this here. Now, at a factor of 0, you're going to get the first shader. At a factor of 1, you're going to get the next shader, so which is white. This is orange and white. Let's say I want certain parts to be maybe a darker orange and some parts to be the lighter orange. And again, 0 is black, white is 1. So if I input this over here, what do you expect is going to happen? Wherever there is black, because it's the first texture, it's 0, it's going to be the lighter orange. And wherever there is white, it's going to be the darker orange. And if you want to see the black and white image, those dots are black. They're going to be the top texture. And that's how you combine textures. So you can make this or make these dots fully transparent, for instance. Again, they're not going to show their color because when you have more saturation in your color, it's not going to look good with transmission. So if you reduce it, it's going to look better. It's going to look more transparent. So what I do is for something like this, where there's glass, and I can make it fully white. And then let's remove these two. Just delete them with X, just like you do with normal objects. Right now, we're only seeing this, and I'm going to delete this one as well. And let's bring in a transparent BSDF. This is what I do with glass most of the time. And I just combine the two. But I don't always combine them here because I'm trying to improve caustics. So let's add plane, bring it down, increase the size. Let's also add a material to this. Okay, you see how there's shadow over here? The caustic aren't that great. What I do is add principled BSDF with a weight of 1 on transmission and then lower the reference a little bit. So now it looks like glass. But before I added the transparent BSDF, it looks a little bit too watery. It's more like water rather than glass. So I like to mix in a shader that is transparent, but for the factor, and just to see the transparent on its own, it looks basically transparent. So if I go back now and I get light path is shadow ray, the search feature is the best feature ever. It's just much easier than bringing it in and then plotting it in. Even though I do have Node Wrangler, I just prefer it this way. And then where there is shadow, it's going to be transparent. If you have color, you can improve the caustics of your glass. And let's just remove this so I can see it better. Especially if you have a lot of color, then your glass is gonna look better. But just so I have a consistent color, I bring in an RGB and I can just plot in the same color for both of these. And this way I can choose whatever color. And I'm 100% sure that my caustics or my fake caustics are gonna look the same. And to make this even better, I sometimes just mix in another color and I bring in the layer weight and I just add a little bit of an edge to the glass because that's realistically how glass looks. So if I bring in the layer weight and then if you see the layer weight, it gives you white edges and then the centers are a little black and then there is a gradient. So if I mix this, well, I don't want this one, I want color. So in mix, there are different options. I want this to be the factor, the facing to be the factor, and then I want to mix in the color. So this, the black parts are going to be this color, and then the white parts are going to be just a dark black. And then if we look at this, it's going to look like this. And you can definitely change the blend of this. It's going to increase the contrast between the blacks and whites. And then you can input this in the color, or you can actually input it just in the transparent color because that's the caustics that we're trying to achieve. And then you can fix it to your liking. It doesn't really look good right now because I'm just rushing to do it. But yeah, that's pretty much what you do to combine textures and enhance your material. That's the basic premise of how you use materials. So I showed you an example with one of the textures, but there are a lot more textures that you can use. There is magic, and if you hit Control-Shift on the same node, you can get a different preview of the different outputs on that node. And then there is a checker texture that gives you a checker basically, and you can change its color from here. And all of these you can add a color ramp to. So where before it was not quite black and white first of all, and even the factor one is not really that vivid in colors or contrasty. So you can just add the color ramp and change how much black you want in your image. And then you can use multiply, for instance, those two textures, and you can get something like this. You can then use a color ramp right after this. And it's just building one node on top of the other to get a full texture in the end. And then you can add this to material, reduce the glossiness. So where there is white, it's going to be metallic. Where there is black, it's not going to be metallic. You can increase the blacks. You can increase the whites, depending on the look you're going for. Another thing that you can do is add textures on top of each other. So if I take the noise, input the factor of the noise. Well, if you look at the noise alone, then play with the settings of the noise, input it into the vector of the other texture. Then we look at the checker texture and it looks completely different. And then as you reduce or increase the values, you're going to get something different. Now, if you, let's say, add a checker onto a Voronoi texture, or actually the opposite, you're going to get a different texture. Just play around with it. There's plenty you can do, and it's really, really fun to play around with it. I've mentioned before that there are some input nodes that you can use, and we've used so far the light path one, but there is one that I use if I want to map the textures based on the object, or if I want to make the texture follow the camera, or if I want to have the texture follow the UV, and that's texture nodes, or texture coordinates, I mean. And you can see how they look on their own. They make absolutely no sense unless you really look into it and understand how they work. But I mostly use the generated UV object and camera. I use camera whenever I want to export an image and I don't really care about animation, or if I want to create some cool animations that change based on where that object is in accordance to the camera. But usually I do have a UV map, so I just use the UV and I input it into mapping and input that into whatever texture I'm using. So let's say Voronoi texture. And then I input that into, let's say, the base color. But because I don't have a UV, I usually use generated or object. And it basically approximates how this material or texture should be inputted into that object. But definitely if you have a UV, just use the UV. But I usually don't use it this way. I'm going to delete it. I just select on the texture, and if I feel like it's not making any sense, I just know that it's using the generated texture or the generated coordinates. So what I do is use Node Wrangler, and for that to work, I just select the texture and then hit Control T, and it generates it for me. And now I can change it to, let's say, object, and it changes the look of it. You can also grab another input, but literally, this is the one I use the most. But if you want, you can try some of the other inputs, like the object info. And the reason why I can't show you everything in this video, because some of the materials like the hair principle BSDF or the curve info doesn't work with any object. I can never use it on this object. It has to be curves that I'm using it on. So right now I can only use the texture coordinate, which is for most objects, and then object info I can also use for such an object. So I can, let's hit Control Shift and go through all of them. This is color, alpha, object index. There isn't always information for all of these. Some of them you have to create yourself. So object index is based on the index that you add over here. Relations, and then pass index, and you can add a different index for the different objects. And now you're gonna have, I have to go back to object index. Now you're gonna have two different colors because you have two different indices for those objects. And then if you go down to random right now, you're gonna see that you have different colors because those two objects have the same material. And so they will be randomized. And then if I grab the cube that I had before, add the same material that we have for all these objects together, then we're gonna have a different color. But I never really use random unless I have an array of objects. But yeah, I don't really like the look it gives me. But now you can use that to randomize the color. You can bring in a color ramp, and then you can change the colors for the color ramp, and it's going to change them based on the grayscale of these, because that's what's going into the factor. And it's based on how far they are based on the factor that you get from this one, because we didn't get enough variation in color. We don't get enough variation of colors over here. So yeah, that's also another way you can use color ramp. There are videos where they go through every little node in Blender, but I'm just going through the ones that I use the majority of the time. And they're very, very limited compared to what some Blender users use. Okay, let's delete all of these. And now let's do something a little different, which is the final thing that we're going to talk about today. And that is how to use external textures. You can outsource a ton of materials from different websites. My favorite is Ambient CG. There are a ton of different websites that are amazing to use in your projects, and they're high quality. But I either create my own textures or I source them from free websites the majority of the time. I do have Southern Shoddy's kit where there is a bunch of different materials like clay material and stuff that I sometimes use. They're really fun to use, so I would support other artists who have worked really hard to create amazing materials that you can just use with a click of a button. But yeah, if you want free materials, my favorite website is Ambient CG, and this is where I go to for most of my wall textures and ground textures. So if I explore all assets, I can look up any of the materials. Let's say I like this one. Let's go in here, and then you can download the different qualities. I usually download either 2K or 4K. I never go above these, and I usually download the JPEG because it's smaller in size than the PNG, but feel free to do whatever you want. Once I download it, I go to my object and I go to Principal BSDF. If you have Node Wrangler, it's going to make things much easier for you. So you can just hit Control-Shift-T while you're hovering over it, or when you select it, actually, not just hovering over it. And then you can go to your folder where you have all of your textures. I'm going to choose this one, and then I'm going to click on the color, displacement, and normal GL. I think these are just opposite of each other, but I'm probably not the one to ask. But I usually just use normal GL. If it's inverted, I just invert it inside of Blender directly. And then roughness. Sometimes there's going to be metallic. Some other times there's going to be transmission or opacity. Those are the ones that I remember being there if the material requires it. But the majority of the time, you're going to see those four. And also there's ambient occlusion. I only use this if I want to add two different colors to where the shadows are and the lights are with the ambient occlusion, but I don't really use it. And the majority of the time, I don't really need it. And then just set up that material. If you don't have Node Wrangler, or if you don't want to use it, then just bring in the images one by one. And this is what a frame is. So it organizes things for you. So now when you move this, it moves inside of the frame. And you can add your frames over here. And if you want to reroute, you can hit Shift, and then with the right mouse, you can just circle it, and now you have a reroute. And when you select it and hit G, you can move it to wherever you want. And that's basically what a reroute is. And you'll need it when you have a lot of nodes. This is a very small node tree, so the majority of the time you're not going to need it. Just this is also a reroute that they did. And then because I don't have a clean UV, I'm just going to do or use generated or object. And you're going to see immediately that Node Wrangler has created a great setup for you. You have the base color into the base color, and then you have the roughness into the roughness. You have the displacement into a displacement node, and then the normal is going to go into a normal map, which is great if you want to decrease how much depth it gives you or how much height it gives you, because it kind of mimics the displacement, but it's not really a displacement of the mesh. It's just showing you that certain places are raised just with light. I sometimes even omit the normal, honestly. I don't really always enjoy how it looks. Something I forgot to mention over here is that for these images that you input yourself, if you don't have Node Wrangler, is that you have to use non-color with roughness, normal, and displacement, or it won't look right. But with Node Wrangler, it just does that for you. The only thing that you need RGB for is the color or the base color. And if you want to see how these two settings look on your material, just change the non-color to RGB on your normal or displacement and see how that affects your material. Now, this is not going to look right because it's not really displacing anything. And that's because if you go to the Materials tab and you go down to Settings below Displacement, you're going to find that displacement is set to bump only when it should be displacement and bump. And you can see that it's looking much better. So let's go back to camera view, and let's reduce the scale. Again, if you have seen the sculpt video, then you'll be able to understand what is going on with displacement. So I'll go down to 0.1. That doesn't look right. I just go down to 0.01. But for a fabric like this, I don't usually add displacement. I just omit it. It works with grounds, great. It works with knit fabric, great. But with something like this that you're not going to get a close-up of is really not that important. So sometimes I just remove this setting over here and just leave it at bump. You know what? Let's just make this a better mesh. So if I go to edge, I'll just mark seam and then U unwrap, and it's going to unwrap it. So what I did is basically opened up the back area on its own and then the front area on its own, because I know that this object is never going to move. And so I don't mind doing it this way. And I'm going to talk about this in the unwrapping video or in the UV map video right after this one. But yeah, if we go to the UV editor, you can see this is the front side and this is the back side. And then if I go to shading, now I can use this mapping to reduce the scale. And it goes the opposite way. So if you go higher, then you make it smaller, because it just means that you're increasing the pattern, you're giving it more space. And if you go down to 0.5, then you're making it bigger. So I go down, or like I scale it to 3, and now we have better fabric. And the texture itself comes with a roughness, so it already gives it a good roughness. So if I remove this and we get the shiny material, well, you can use it, but it's not what the material is. Sometimes I do change things, so it's not always the same exact thing. And then displacement is just adding that detail to the fabric itself, so you can actually see it right here in the whites. And then normal map is doing the same exact thing, but it's just adding a little bit more shadow. Sometimes it makes the scene, or it makes the objects a little darker, and so I sometimes remove it, and it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But yeah, so this is how you add textures. Let's add another one. For the ground, we can go to Principal BSDF, we can select it, hit Ctrl+Shift+T, and we get the materials. Let's go up a level, and then I'm gonna do tiles. Let's just choose anything. We'll get color, displacement, normal, GL, roughness, create the setup. You'll notice that even when I change this setting to displacement and map, also you can change it from here. If you hover over here and hit N, then you can go to options, settings, displacement, and bump, which is what I do most of the time. You'll see that it just went down, and that's because of the mid-level. So if I go at 0, it'll go back to its original area, but it will raise everything because it's mostly white and it's seeing that it should go up, but there is absolutely no geometry in the mesh. And this displaces the vertices, so it needs geometry. So what I'm going to do is go into edit mode and then right click, subdivide, and make it 20, even 30. And we can also add a little bit more subdivision over here, and it went crazy. So we have to reduce the scale to 0.1 at least. It will need much less. You can see how much height it gotten. And it's still not perfect just because the subdivision isn't enough for the details and the displacement. There are very small areas that are black. So you can just add more subdivision, or you can go to experimental in the render here and then go back to the subdivision and hit adaptive subdivision. But this will increase your render time tremendously depending on your textures. And if I change this mid-level to 0.5, so it went back down a little. You can also do 1, and it'll just start from here downward. So it'll push the blacks down, but it's not moving the whites, so it's back to its original position, kind of, not really. but I always leave it at 0.5. Sometimes I just adjust the mid-level based on how the object are intersecting, and then even reduce the scale to even 0.05. Sometimes I even do 0.01, and it just looks a little bit more realistic. Yeah. And if we go back to this, we can add to it. So what I like to do all the time is pull from the color, get a mix color. Well, mix is just one node that you can change into mix floats or vectors, but I use it mostly for color. And then input the result into the base color. And now I can add another color. And instead of mix, I can just multiply and increase this like that. And this way I'm changing the colors a little bit. You can also go to color, and that will change the color completely into the different color. And however you use the factor, it's going to affect it. But you can also change this into a black and white image, so RGB to black and white, and then use that as the factor. So now it's a black and white image that you can play around with. Also, I push everything right here so I can give room to my color adjustments. And now this can go into the factor, and based on the blacks and whites, the blacks are going to get the A color and the whites are going to get the B color, but then everything in between is just going to get a color in between. So we can remove this right now and change it to whatever color. We get a completely different colorway. We can do multiply the two colors over here. We can do just colorize it. We can only focus on the hue, just gonna give us an exact replica of the colors with some range in between. You can also add a color ramp to change the RGB values that you got over here to something a lot more contrasty. We can move this one, and then we can input this into the factor instead. You can see that the greens are a little bit brighter because we changed this, and you can see the colors change over here. And if I go to material view, you can see things better. My computer doesn't render that fast, so you still see delays and noisiness when you change the material. But yeah, you can see it over here. And based on the colors you choose, you get different looks. And you can do the same to this one. I can also copy and paste what I did over here to this material. You have to have one active for the copy to work. And now we turn it into black and white. We go to the color ramp. It's too much for this one. And we get a different range of color. While the black or the whites are going to be the grout, and then the other ones are going to be a range of color. You can also create a color ramp. So if you want to change this to a color, you can definitely do that. And voila, you have a different color. And if we go to render view, we can see our great colors more clearly. I just can't handle the colors I chose. Anyway, you get the gist. And then lastly, I also mix it with other materials. So if I want to add a mix shader, let's say I want to add a glossy material or kind of like glitter or something, and then I bring on a Voronoi texture, use a color ramp, and you can see that it repeats over and over again because there isn't much to it really. Just playing around with a few settings that you have for the most basic materials that you need. And like I said, you can hit Control T with a texture, and then you can use the UV, or you can use the object. We're going to use the object. Also increase the scale so you get more dots. And now where there is black, or the zeros are going to get this material, and then where there is white, we're going to get this material. And if you remember, the blacks are the dots. So if you want to switch them, you can just plot this one into the blacks and put the bigger material into the whites. We can decrease the roughness. I do this, and then I increase the size. And if I look at the final material, we have kind of glittery texture on top of our fabric. So yeah, we're repeating the same concepts over and over again to get different materials. That's pretty much it for our materials video. If you feel confused, that's fine. I haven't created this to explain everything I create because that just doesn't make any sense. Maybe we can go through the fabric materials and how I create those. Or maybe we can create a scene with different materials and we can go through all of those materials. There are different ideas that we can do to delve more into materials. But yeah, for now, this is pretty much what I can do with showing you my workflow with the materials. This is the most realistic way of showing it. I hope you gleaned some information from this video and kind of understood how I create my materials. And if you have any questions, just please leave them in the comments below so the answer can reach everyone. And that's it. Talk to you later. Bye.